In the model horse world and here at DeeJayBe Studios, I replicate the nature of the horse for a living. If you don't already know me, hi, my name is Darynn, and I don't like to admit it, but I like the rules. I like making horses because there is guidelines on anatomy, color, and how to get to the final outcome, which is impressive, but can lack the creativity that comes with art. And though I'm inspired by the nature and world around us in its true form, I am beginning to explore the world of fantasy. Fantasy is free. It has no rules, no guidelines. I like to challenge myself when it comes to art, whether that be making a horse out of tails or making a horse out of a fish. Yes, you heard that right. A fish. Ever seen Planet Earth? Documentary series on nature. Right up my alley and right up the theme of this video. Then I saw a fish. A lionfish. And I knew right there, right then, that was it. Nature will always inspire us, just not exactly how we expect it. I would like to invite you on this journey, the challenges, the trials and tribulations it took to create the one, the only, the fish, Kai. Before we get started, I would just like to say all of the tools and supplies used in this video are listed in the description below and on my website at www.deejaybe.com/customize. These links are affiliate links that help support my studio, artwork, and videos like this. If you would like to learn more about the world of model horses and be a part of the community while also supporting this channel, you can find exclusive behind-the-scenes content on my Patreon at DeeJayBe Studios. If you'd like to learn more about me and DeeJayBe Studios as a whole, I have a portfolio of works, sales, and a plethora of other tutorials available on my website, www.deejaybe.com. Be sure to sign up for the mailing list to be in the know of studio happenings. Find me on all social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at DeeJayBe Studios. Monetary support helps but is not necessary, so just be sure to like this video and subscribe to this channel so I can continue making art and content just like this. Thank you so much for listening. Now please enjoy the rest of this video. So the backstory for Kai essentially started in June of 2022, and I did in fact sketch this drawing while watching the Planet Earth documentary. I wanted this to be a best customs entry, and I knew that I wanted it to be a fantasy entry. I wanted to explore fantasy since it's very popular in the model horse community, especially horse-fish hybrids. I wanted to make my fantasy piece not a hybrid, but rather a horse inspired by the fish. When I made my original sketch, I knew that I wanted the color palette of the lionfish. I wanted to use the zebra pattern as reference for the body stripes on the horse. So this is Kai, and Kai essentially means sea or ocean in Hawaiian. I have really strong roots and ties to Hawaii, so I feel like that was the perfect name for him. And I went straight to picking the best model for this project. This Sato model was the perfect beginning base for the pose I wanted to create. We all know how we start, and I just made some marks using a Sharpie of where I was going to be making cuts and what needed to come off, and I got straight to the hacksawing right away, removing the tail firstly and then to the ears. Chuck those in the trash, chuck the tail in the body bin. And then I decided to Dremel this guy outside. We had just moved into our new house, so like I was still figuring out how to Dremel, where to Dremel, and all the things. So enjoy this very chaotic Dremeling session where I am outside in sandals on a tiny stool. Not good for your back or your spine at all. Using a sanding drum on a Dremel sander, I just started to remove a bunch of the facial detailing. I like to remove this before I cut off the head because it's just easier to work with as a solid piece of plastic. So I wanted to completely resculpt the face in this case, but I didn't initially want this to be too drastic of a project, and it ended up being quite drastic. That tends to happen. Then I took my hacksaw and I proceeded to chop off the head because it was all sanded clean. Also took off the neck and took off extra pieces of the neck. until I was happy. I dremeled into the backs and fronts of the legs to create some bends, and I do this at the leg stage first, and then I will cut into the shoulder. And so this, once again, is just so that it's stable and solid. So we're working through cutting, sanding, and heating. This is my embossing tool. I actually don't recommend using that anymore. I bought an actual heat gun and it works 10,000 times better. So skip this step, get yourself a heat gun. Once everything is bent correctly, I can actually start to cut the pieces off. So I just essentially removed that leg because it was going to be too dramatic. I ended up removing both. This is sometimes just easier than trying to move the shoulder. The hope was to not sculpt so much muscle variation, but I ended up basically resculpting most of this horse in the end. So you'll see. This was a learning experience for sure. I make cuts down the center lines of the hips so that I'm able to move them independently. And that was the final outcome and the mess that I made. So a couple horse parts, and I had to clean up my little cement patio out here. Then I had to craft the wings and the hair. So I've started sketching things on paper and kind of cutting them out and templating them, and I find that that helps a lot, especially for really dramatic tails. And these wings, I honestly had no clue how I was going to achieve them. This was my first attempt, which was using some foam core. And I thought that I could attach wire and kind of put clay on top of these. If anything, this would just give me a visual so that I knew what I was working with. But you're fighting not just the wing, but how you're going to attach the wing to the body. So this worked really well because these are really lightweight and they were easy to shape and cut. But adding clay to the surface, I can't use polymer because this can't go in the oven. I can use freeform air, but like it doesn't sand super nicely. So I hot glued some wires on them, hoping that that would solidify it better. And I made a bit of a base, but like I didn't know how the heck I was going to do this. I had no clue what I was doing, and I gave up. For 2023, I completed Tallulah. She was a bit of an easier execution. This was also the year that we just moved in the house, just got married. So there's a lot of transition, a lot of change, and I just didn't have the mental capacity to figure out wings. But I did have the mental capacity to craft a horse out of tails in between this. I don't make the rules. I guess I just break the rules. My brain is a very confusing place. And so I didn't touch this again until July of 2024. After I came home from Breyer Fest, I thought I should tackle this again. I just scrapped everything I had done previously, and I was using cause clay here. Cause clay bakes in the oven like a polymer clay, but it retains its flexibility, so therefore the wings would be less fragile. That was the thought behind it. But in the back of my brain, as I created these wings, I was wondering how I was going to paint them if they were flexible, because that causes problems with primer cracking, sealer cracking, and paint cracking in general. I was trying to make these the least amount of effort as possible. I find with stuff like this, I spend a lot of time thinking how annoying it's going to be and being in the process of making it and just being annoyed by it because it's like 20 wing pieces that I have to make. Instead of just taking some time, putting on a show and embracing it, I really fought this. So I didn't want these to be like super textured like this. The holes I just added for fun. I was just making something. I was not in the best mental state of mind. I then took them to cookie sheets and baked them in my oven, and they did in fact cure to be flexible, but the wire I inserted on the insides of them was way too flimsy. And so the biggest ones just basically flopped over, and it was a huge disaster. So I left it until September of 2024 when I decided to pick it back up. The deadline for this is hypothetically June or July. This was like a pseudo contest entry, but like I couldn't enter the contest. So this is just my yearly project that I was going to reveal at the same time as the Best Customs contest. So started with the face because I thought if I could get a decent face, maybe I would be inclined to finish the project. For this, I wasn't super intense about realism. Because it's fantasy, I can have a bit more liberty in the expression, making the eyes a bit bigger, making the wrinkles a bit more dramatic. You can see that this is glued to a Roxy Breyer because the head is hollow. and it just so happened to fit perfectly on her nose. So I hot glued it to her, and then I was kind of able to reference the eyeballs with the eyes I was sculpting. Maybe this is a pro tip, I don't know, but we're just shaping out the eyes and shaping out the face. Lots of trial and error. I always end up kind of moving things, ripping things off. It's very hard to get the symmetry on the first shot. This just takes time and practice. I then was able to sculpt some nostrils. I wanted these to be pretty flared. The original cigar head honestly would have worked pretty good for this, but it's not as impressive if you haven't resculpted the head, so that's the life I live. Smoothing everything out with some isopropyl alcohol. I was really happy with this shape. Just using a mixture of tools, my fingers, and a brush to make everything nice and smooth. And then moving to the facial details, I lay down vague noodles of where the muscles should be. And I've let the nostril cure here, and I've let the eye cure here so that I won't screw it up as I proceed to work with the rest of the face. I've started using these flat kind of spoony tools. I find them really good for facial detailing like this, and just in general, a little bit easier to kind of get the shape and form that I'm hoping for. The ears always start out as two little balls that I then flatten into ear almondy shapes, and I let those cure. I then am going to attach the legs to the horse again because he has no front legs, so I'm unable to really work on the wings until I have a fully standing horse. So I stuffed him full of some toilet paper rolls, super glue, baking soda, and some heavy steel wire. I like using the steel for really strong pieces. Aluminum I find has too much give at times. Generous amount of glue in there, and I make sure that that wire is really long and kind of inserts through the whole body of the horse. I can then pop off the cured head from the Roxy, and I just put a bunch of baking soda in the bottom of it, bunch of super glue, and then I kind of twist a little like loop at the end of the wire to insert into the back of the head there, and then add more super glue, more baking soda. I find this works the best to avoid just getting glue everywhere. And I did put a secondary little aluminum wire twist underneath for the bottom of the neck, which I do sometimes if I feel like it needs more stability. And then I encase the whole thing in tin foil so that I can get a good silhouette. I'll also use the tin foil to fill any gaps or holes that are peeking through. Using a bit of clay, I'm using Magic Sculpt through this project. I have a video on the difference between epoxy and Magic Sculpt, but that's my preferred clay. And I'll just start by fleshing out the neck in terms of silhouette and just looking for rigidness here. Sometimes I'll use freeform air for this phase, but sometimes I'll just go straight to clay. And in this case, I'm just trying to make the neck and the wither more accurate. I'm trying to fill in those big holes so that my brain can see that the length of the neck is good, because it can be hard to tell when everything is like straight tinfoil. And I'm gonna just kind of fill in some of this, and then I'm gonna let it cure, and then I'm gonna sculpt the actual muscles on top. And so that's just gonna help make everything really solid and really easy to work with, because you don't want to be fighting floppy clay, especially when you got to push pretty hard here. I then fill in some of the major gaps and holes, so these leg connections, my brain once again can see the true silhouette of the model. And you can see that there's a magnet in the belly of this guy, and that was from those original wings. I tried to do a magnet thing. It didn't work. So I let all that first layer of epoxy cure, and then I take it to my now Dremel station in my garage, and I smooth out all of those seams so that everything is like nice and flush. And this is going to be my base that's now solid, has no holes, and is ready for the detailing phase. And I can take down anything that is a little bit incorrect or a little bit too lumpy or bumpy, because that has a tendency of happening. The face is basically fully sculpted though, which is fun. So now it's just working the body. I then jump right back to the neck because I'm really focused on getting this correct here and making sure that everything is good before I move on to the wings. Adding quite a bit of clay to the neck area to create the muscle definition. I'm using reference, but I'm also taking liberty to not be 100% perfectly anatomical, and I think that's okay in these instances of a fantasy piece. This is a fish horse hybrid something or other, so we can have muscles that aren't quite right. We can have more wrinkles that are there. That's the fun part about fantasy, is there are no rules to follow, which sometimes can be a bit more challenging, honestly. So I make the rough guideline of where those shapes should be, and then I continue to form everything using my fingers, tools, and smoothing everything out with isopropyl alcohol. I thought it would be fun to add little eyelashes to his face. This really brought him to life and tied him together, made him look a lot more realistic and a lot nicer. So I add that on when everything else is cured. It's much easier to do so at that point, and using a pointer tool can really help get into those tiny little areas. These wrinkle details can sometimes be added in when the clay has cured for a little bit and is a little more firm. I find it takes detail a lot nicer. I will then continue to muscle up the rest of the body. I found that I actually ended up sculpting majority of this horse with new muscle sculpture. I was focusing a lot on composition and silhouette in this piece, so I made some of the features a little more exaggerated and a little more graphical almost. Just in general, I wanted the legs to feel less like a horse and more like elegant. And I added quite a few wrinkle elements here too, to the different areas of the body where I felt like wrinkles would happen, because he's got like fish skin. It's gonna be glossy. Those ears cured up nicely, so then I take a little ball of epoxy and I just attach it to the base of the ear, and then I can just stick them onto the side of the head and play with the position while the clay is still wet. Sometimes I put a wire and attach the ears that way, but not all the time. And truly, this clay is quite durable and rigid. Unless you're dropping this horse on its ears, they're not going to break. Onto the hindquarters is the same thing. I had sanded away some of this plastic, so I ended up having to sculpt a little bit of it. You can see I salvaged some of the shoulder, but I ended up having to resculpt a significant amount. In my original drawing, the horse had little fins on its legs and fins down its back, and I actually wasn't sure that I wanted to execute that when I was actually sculpting the model. A lot of the time, the original drawing definitely gets like lost in translation. We want to make something that's aesthetically pleasing, and I just didn't want to add too much happening. I felt like the wings and the color was already going to be a lot, so I didn't want to add too much in terms of the rest of the horse. So it ended up just being kind of a horse with wings, which is fine, but I think if I had done fins down the spine of it, it would have been a little bit overwhelming as a visual. Once that was all cured up, I drilled some holes into the neck, and this is for the mane. So I'm going to be using aluminum wire for the mane because it's easy to bend and easy to form. And then I insert the wires just straight and give them generous length. And then as I kind of insert them into these holes, I'll start to shape them and form them based on how I want the hair to look and feel. Once I'm happy, I'll solidify those in with some super glue and baking soda. And I have my baking soda in a little squeezy bottle. I was trying this and it worked pretty well for this instance. So you can play with that if that works for you, but I find sprinkling it is often just easier. I then took some time because I wasn't sure how I wanted the hair to be, so I sketched it out on my iPad, just taking a photo of the horse. I can sketch in the silhouette of what I'm hoping to achieve. That just helps me visualize what I want to do without sculpting it all in clay and then realizing I hate it and having to rip it off. I then take that drawing as reference and I'll bend the pieces into the shape that I'm hoping for. And then I will also cut them to the proper length. And I'm making sure that I have not just dynamic flow in the upwards portion, but also side to side. So looking at the horse head on, you want some of those hairs to kind of be out to the side a little bit on both sides. So this was a lot of fun and it's going to look really cool, but it's going to be quite a bit of sculpting for sure. And once I'm happy with the shape of the wire, I just go straight ahead with clay. Sometimes I'll use masking tape, but I'm honestly finding clay is easier to use these days. And so I will just make flat little chunky strips, and I'm just creating, once again, silhouette. It's all about the eye, it's all about the negative space, and I want this to be a nice thin flat base to then sculpt proper hair on top of. The biggest thing is that I don't want this to be too thick and clumpy. And then if it's got areas that are too bulky, you can sand those down. For the tail, I took several strands of this aluminum wire and I twisted them together. This tail was going to be hefty, so I made sure I had a good solid base. And this allows me to have all these strands to work with to create the flow of the tail. I always leave the tail, especially when they're big dramatic tails like this, I leave them detached from the model until the very end of the sculptural process so that I'm able to fully sand and work on the horse and fully sculpt the tail much easier than if it's attached to this horse. He was quite long, like he's probably 12 inches long. So he's hard to manage and mitigate, especially with the pokey mane and the pokey tail. So I did the same as for the mane, just adding some little flat noodly strips to create the structure and the base and the flow. So there we have the horse, and he's looking a lot cooler now because he's got more silhouette to him with his fully finished hair. And I love this phase. I find it's so rewarding to see the outcome. But now I have to face the demon of inserting these wings. So I found 2 pieces of little wood, and I thought this was going to be the best way to go about this. So I drew a line where they needed to be, and then I drilled holes kind of close to each other. Then I cut those with wire cutters, and then I was able to kind of pull out that plastic using some pliers. And I was able to pull out the old magnet stuff that I had in there as well. So that worked fairly well in terms of creating a hole, but it's tricky because you want that hole to be the right size and shape of the wood. Once I had most of that plastic out, Breyers are quite thin in terms of how much plastic is there, so then I was just able to Dremel down the edges so that everything was smooth. But I'm being careful not to go too wide. I'm checking with the wood, seeing how much more I need to do. And this is not for the faint of heart. This took a lot of back and forth and a lot of time. This took several days to kind of sort out, and it was very mentally taxing. Like, I didn't want to work on it because it was frustrating. It was not easy, but slowly the holes became the right size and I could then insert those little wood pieces in there decently. Once both of them were kind of inserted, I realized they were sticking out quite a bit, so I was going to need to remove some of that internal filler that I put in. You kind of have to work on this as a whole because it's all got to work out before you get too into the weeds of detailing. So I matched up the sizing of the previous cosplay wings that I made that didn't work, and I kind of sanded down the little wood piece of how I wanted it to be, and then I started drilling holes for these pieces of wire. And so this is that really strong steel wire again, and my new theory was that I was going to sculpt this with epoxy. It might break, it might crack, I don't know, but I'm going to try because there's no other method that would work. I couldn't use polymer clay because I made this on a wood base. That was dumb of me. This was so hard. They were all falling out of there, and it was like hard to get the right amount of them, like get them all in there. This piece of wood was not that big, so like drilling holes into it, it was not super sturdy either. Like, wood is pretty fragile. It's a pretty soft medium to be using. And once everything was kind of working, I could then super glue and baking soda them all in, and then I could shape them. So that's kind of what I did. I just made sure that they were all in there good, and then I used a ton of super glue and baking soda. One of the problems with this though is that the wires could turn within the hole, so they were fighting me a little bit because there was moments where they wanted to be twisty and stupid. And then I realized I had to cut off the excess off the bottom, but this like steel wire is near impossible to cut. It was crippling my hand. I was regretting my decision because this is one side of the wing. I still have to make a second wing. And if you're making it this hard on the first wing, it's going to be just as hard on the second wing. You can see that the cutters don't actually cut it. They just kind of dent it. And then you have to like bend them off. But there was a lot of wires kind of congregated in the one spot, and it was making the bottom of this real ugly. But I went with it, I stuck with it, and I was able to insert it into the side of the horse, and it was actually working. I was actually surprised, but still a little bit wiggly in terms of the wood going into the plastic. So I was just bending those into shape and checking that they were all going to work. And this did miraculously work. So I made the other wing as well, kind of put them both in. I was going to see how it was going to balance. The presence of this with these wires was really exciting to me. This horse is quite large in terms of a sculpture. But once I was sure that that was going to work, then I could rework on the holes and how I was going to make those kind of fasten in there properly. So I pulled out a lot of the toilet paper roll that I previously shoved in there as filler, and it's fine because now everything's in clay. It didn't weaken anything, there was just a lot of filler. And it was around this time that I thought maybe I should just make it one solid piece, and that was a thought I had several times along this process, but it genuinely would have been impossible to transport anywhere. So I needed these wings to be detachable, so I forced myself to figure it out. I had several phases of dremmeling and reorganizing how this was going to work. And I think by this point, you probably understand that I am not an engineer and definitely don't take engineering advice from me. And then I thought, if I put cling wrap around the body of this, and I insert the wings into the holes, and then I sculpt the base onto the body of the horse. Hypothetically, I should be able to pop the wings out and in, and they should stay in place better than they currently are because they'll have a lip of clay on them. That was the running theory. So I taped this horse all up, added some cling wrap, threw the wings in, and added some clay on top. Pretty crudely, like it wasn't super clean or perfect, but I thought this was gonna work, so I'd be able to like shimmy them in and out. I was rudely incorrect about this, and it did not work at all. The wings were actually jammed in the horse at that point, and I had to pull all the clay off and rethink about how I was going to do that. I took a break in the meantime and started sculpting the tail. This is where I would just add a thin layer of epoxy to the already cured epoxy base. I'm able to add details and lines for the texture. I'm using this flat spoon tool, and I really like this tool for this kind of look. I wanted to make it have larger grooves than my normal hair sculpture that I do, so I didn't want it super detailed and refined. So to make the wings actually sit inside of the body of the horse, I did a process of adding some tape and super glue to the edges so that I could further make the hole the right shape. And then I inserted some tin foil and clay so that I could make a nicer looking inside, and I didn't want like holes in it and it to be fully exposed. So I actually took the time to sculpt inside of it, and then I was able to push the wings that were now shaped a little bit better and just fit a little bit tighter in there. And so I wasn't 100% sure this was gonna work still, honestly, but it was feeling like it would, so I kind of just went for it and let it happen. So then I had a really fine wire. I don't even know what this is. I found it somewhere in my house, and I just wrapped all of these wire posts for the wings in this fine wire, and this makes it so that I can add clay to them and it's not going to fall off. You add clay to just a smooth wire piece, it wants to twist, it wants to slough off, it's a pain in the butt. So this makes it really easy for the clay to stick and want to stay where it's told to stay. So I did this for all of the strands of the wings, and it drew blood, literally. This was blood, sweat, and tears at this point. And then I was just able to add a basic flat shape to this wire structure to kind of create the wings. The hardest thing about using epoxy is that it's very lumpy and it often doesn't want to be super smooth without a ton of sanding. So I took my time. Honestly, that's all I kind of needed to do from the beginning, was just take my time. I wanted the edge unnatural and not super smooth, but I didn't want to add holes this time. I didn't actually like the holes. And once I had the whole wing kind of fleshed out, I let him cure against the wall, and he ripped a piece of the drywall out. It looked really cool, and the tail also looked really cool, and things were starting to pull together. I was pretty excited at this point. This horse had a presence to it. But the kicker with wing projects is that once you have one, you also need a second one. And I won't bore you with the details. You just saw me do the other one. But he was looking really cool with 2 wings happening there. I also had to take the time to then fix the drywall. Thank you very much, fish. So I had to spot it, I had to sand it, and I had to paint it. This is my backdrop for all my pictures, and I didn't want a piece of drywall missing. Small interlude. And then I got lazy, and I decided that I should just use Bondo to fill all the imperfections in the sculpture instead of using more clay. So I tested it by letting it cure and then dremeling it down, and it kind of worked. It kind of didn't. It was kind of a waste of the Bondo, honestly. They just really needed a good Dremel session. That was going to be the fastest way to kind of smooth them out. So I took some time to do this. I found that the outcome was pretty good. It was going to need some touch up in some of the areas. I took the liberty to then prime the body of the horse so that I could see what he was looking like. And for the wings, I then took them outside after I did the dremeling, and I rebondoed all of them again. So this was definitely an outdoor activity. This was a lot of Bondo and a lot of work, and once again, it kind of worked, but kind of not really. This is me trying to be lazy, but it just ends up taking more time. So then in my infinite wisdom, I brought the wings indoors, and I sanded them on my carpet and my pants. And Bondo is a lot of red dye, So everything in my house was not quite the same after this moment. And halfway through this, I thought maybe this was a poor decision. Maybe this was a bad idea, but I was too far committed. So I finished the wings and decided to sand the rest of the horse as well because everything was already covered in dust. The horse didn't actually need too much prep. He was looking pretty good. I wet him down with a cloth as I work so that I'm able to see. That's my little tip and trick, and it seems to work really well. Then I tried to wipe my pants off with a wet cloth. Did not work. Tried to wipe the carpet with a wet cloth. Did not work. Then I started to panic that this carpet would be forever ruined. I vacuumed it very aggressively and it picked up some of it. Definitely wasn't a good idea to add water. So I ended up having to use a stain remover, and the carpet did come clean. It just needed a minute to soak. I made sure to re-drill an air hole in the groin. This is really important for these Breyer customs that are hollow. And I didn't like the shape of the ears. I didn't like how they were kind of more back and they weren't sticking out from the front profile. They weren't as obvious as I wanted them to be. So I lopped them off and kind of reattached them at more of a sideways angle. And this was just like a little detail that was bugging me, and I'm really glad that I did fix it in the end. And so after all my discussion of ears and not using wires, I find when I'm reattaching them in a slightly different position, it's just easier to use wire. I used a big drill for the butt, and I was committed to attaching the tail for reals. I also added a chunk of steel wire to it so that it was really secure in the body because I did not want it to break. And it actually was really rigid. I ended up holding the horse at the tail for a lot of the painting, and it did really well. Then I just added some extra detailing to further refine the attachment of the tail to the rest of the body. I'm back with the cling wrap, and this time I have a mission to create the base of the wings. So the wings themselves are done, but we need a connection point to the body of the horse so that it looks like they're not detachable, if that makes sense. So I cling wrapped the model, inserted the wings, and then I was able to sculpt an attachment on top. This time it worked because the wings themselves were actually inserted correctly, and I just created some like muscly detail with kind of a fringed edge. This didn't work perfectly, and there are some imperfections on the final piece. They're not perfectly symmetrical, and it doesn't maybe fully make sense from a muscle perspective. And once the wings were completed, they were surprisingly durable and rigid, so the epoxy worked great. Then I continued to prep and prime the rest of the model and the wings. I found that adding several layers of hand-painted gesso to the wings seemed to smooth things out a lot better. So I did that until I had the model completely prepped and ready for paint. I want to estimate that this took around 50 hours to sculpt and troubleshoot. Come April 2025, I was able to start painting. So I diluted down some Joe Sanja acrylic to send through the Iwata Eclipse airbrush. So I'm just using a cream color, and I wanted an opaque base coat here. For the wings, I thought it would be easiest to just paint the whole thing orange because this horse was going to be predominantly orange. I lacked to think about the fact that I needed some yellow tones in there, and you can't really add yellow back to orange. This is a common theme about this project. I was on a time crunch to get this piece done for the live show that was coming up in like a week's time. So I was feeling the pressure, and I worked on this for days to just get it done. So I started with a like yellow tone on the underbelly, and then I faded that into a orange tone. I wanted this to be mostly orange, so I was really working with that orange tone in there. I thought about doing stripes via airbrush, so I like tested that a little bit on the butt, but I changed my mind and said I'm just gonna hand paint them. I think it'll be less of a pain in the butt than airbrushing because I didn't want like that soft edge. But this orange ended up too dark, so then I added in some lighter tones on top, which actually worked pretty good. And then I add a red tone down the top line and kind of on the legs. The key here was making things not too red and letting the orange peek through. And then the black is at the very top of the top line, at the feet and along the tops of the neck, and then the mane and tail are going to be solid black. Adding the black paint like this, you want to make sure your airbrush is working really good so that you don't get any sputtering or like too much grain in the transition. I then hand painted the rest of the hair, and he was looking pretty cool. Very orange, a little too red. I wasn't totally happy with the outcome, but I thought it was okay. And then I reattempted the wings by slowly going in with some soft oranges and some yellows, kind of allowing some of that cream color to peek through so that it wasn't so abrupt. These colors are very translucent, so they're hard to work with, and you have to layer it properly or else things get really muddy really fast. I tipped all of them with white because that was on my original sketch. And then I added some darker tones in there with some reds and some blacks and kind of shaded. I didn't really know what I was doing. Going with what I felt was right in my heart. I ultimately repainted these wings probably 8 times. Half of it was not filmed, so just know none of this went right. And I darkened up some of the portions on the wings with some shading using black, and it ended up being quite dark, but I let it be. I sealed off the model, I let it cure, and then I was using a white watercolor pencil to draw on the zebra stripes. And I inserted the wings to make sure that connection point was good as well. And anything I messed up, I used a little Q-tip dipped in some glass cleaner. And then I also outlined where I was going to paint the little white stripes on the wings. This helped me visualize the final outcome, but I was a little trigger happy and I went straight to the white markings. And I contemplated how I wanted to do this. This was going to be so many layers of white, and I kind of just went for it, blocking in quite a bit of this, and it got really chunky and really thick really fast. I feel like I was rushing it a little too much. Like I was really excited to get to the stripes, so like I didn't shade any of the horse. I thought I could just shade it after. The stripes got really fat really fast, and it looked very zebra, but that wasn't really the look I was going for. So I agonized over this for like 2 days. I ultimately decided that it was going to bother me. And I'll have you know, there was only a couple days left to the show deadline at this point. So like repainting this was not on my radar. Ultimately, it's always better when you redo it. So I went for it, even though there was like lines from the stripes being painted on. So the painting process was just as hard as figuring out the wings on this horse. So it was not for the faint of heart, but I took more care this time to make things more yellowy, more orange, and a little lighter in their tones, and then adding just a touch of darkness. And I feel like the outcome was a lot more clean. I often find that I think you learn from your mistakes the first go around. So my recommendation is probably to do like a little test on like a Stablemate or something before just full sending it. I also feel like a big part of this was me letting go of some control, because there were no rules of like how this horse needed to be painted. I was feeling the pressure of making it perfect, but there was no such thing as perfect because this didn't exist in real life. It challenged me, and I can see where I lack in my creative process a little bit, and I definitely need to do more stuff like this to kind of step out of my comfort zone. I've never quite been so unsure of my talent and my skill set to complete something like this. This was the most challenging piece I've done in a very long time. And I made sure to make those zebra stripes on the horse much thinner so that more of the color could show through the final outcome. I could also play with kind of the direction of the stripes and how I wanted them to look. And then before I was allowed to paint any of the white, I took time to graphically shade the body. I took darker tones of oranges, yellows, and reds, and I accentuated all of my sculptural line work. And I wanted to do this graphically in a sense that these aren't blended. These are hard contrasted lines, and I'll do dark and then I'll do light pieces to accent the sculpture in other areas. I feel like this worked really, really well in terms of the final piece, because then I was able to paint the white on top, and it just made everything look really graphical and almost like a comic book. I had a lot of fun playing with this. This was a new technique and style. So I had a ton of mixes for this horse. I painted his eyes because I really like painting the eyes to help see the life of the model. Red based with orange and yellow highlights. So all the black got lined with a darker red tone. And I find that some of those imperfections in the sculpture can actually be hidden by the paintwork, and even more so when the final model is sealed. Then I had to repaint that mane and tail again, solid black, so that I could figure out how to shade the mane and tail. So I went in with just some dark red tones. I actually ended up finding some tones that were darker than the body, and I did kind of gradient work of like starting with the red and then adding the orange and then adding the yellow, and then I could add white stripes on top. I find with these Joe Sanja paints, they're so matte, you can see every little thing until you seal the horse. And then once you seal it, it kind of blends it together, and this paintbrush was really my saving grace. But I didn't get too far on the hair before I decided to attempt the white striping again. This time I went in with a much finer brush, but being a lot more careful. And at this point, I was realizing that this was going to take forever. White paint takes the most layers, it's the least opaque, and so I was going to need to do a lot of hand painting these stripes over and over and over again. So I was regretting my decisions, but it was looking so cool, and I knew it was going to be worth it. It's just, it always has a moment in the painting phase where you want to throw it out the window. I then moved on to the wings, and I did the same detailing steps as the body, where I accented with some lighter colors, painted in the darker colors, and did kind of a graphical shading approach. I started blocking out the white, and I mainly just wanted to block everything so that I had the fully completed look, and I could put the horse together and like make sure that it was actually working in terms of cohesive paint job, because the body stripes were quite thin, but then the wings were going to have really chunky kind of white patches to them. And I liked using this flat square brush to do a lot of those lines, and then I had to go back in with a finer brush to do the smaller lines that go towards the horse's body. But everything seemed to work and appeared cohesive. And I proceeded to paint the rest of the tail as well. So I jump back and forth a lot now in my painting process because I find I get bored easy, and it's just good to get as much paint down as possible. So if it keeps me interested to go from the tail to the stripes to the tail again, that's how I'll do it. And this guy was really hard to paint because he was so long. He was hard to hold and hard to maneuver and like prop up on the desk in like a fashion that wasn't killing my neck or my back. So it was a struggle, but we slowly worked our way through it. Once I finished the first wing, I then painted the second wing so that I was able to focus on symmetry, because they needed to be semi-symmetrical. So that was easiest to do after the first one, was more so fleshed out. I didn't actually like the white tips on the wings, so I ended up airbrushing them black. I thought that this would pull everything a little more cohesively together. And then once the white was kind of fleshed out and I had done a bunch of layers, I was able to kind of further refine the detailing in between each wing, and I was able to solidify those black tips. And here we're just adding more white layers to the already painted stripe. My eyes were hurting so bad. I had to use reading glasses for most of this. The contrast was so intense and it just took so long and so much focus and precision to like make sure that you got the white in the white line that you'd already painted. It was a struggle and a journey, to say the least. But then he was complete and I was very happy that I redid him. I feel like there's less white, so it really accents the color instead of it just being super duper white. So once I was pretty much done and happy, I signed his belly in some orange and took him outside for a good little seal. I used Americana matte sealer, which actually has a very glossy sheen to it. So I find that the sealer is really good in terms of actually sealing. It makes the piece very hydrophobic. It has a nice like sheen to it where it's not super glossy, it's not super matte, but it never goes sticky, and that's the biggest thing that we want. Once it was dried, I then glossed the nostrils, glossed the eyeballs, and I glossed the hooves. The hooves were just solid black, so they took a couple coats of gloss for some reason. They didn't want to gloss properly. And then I took him all the way to the beach and did a photo shoot. It was very cool to see him on the beach. I took my little camera slider and had a whole little setup. When I brought him home after the beach, it had sloughed all the paint off of his feet because it's like sandpaper. So that was unfortunate, but regardless, the photos turned out really well. And then I was actually able to take him to a live show. So I hustled for his paint job to be completed within a month to prep for this show at the beginning of May. Fantasy class was at the end of the day, so we had to go through all the custom horses, and he was kind of one of the very last classes of the day. And I took Tallulah with me as well, so it was like my big moment to reveal him.
Christy? I said, what the that? Where were you hiding it? How come I haven't seen it before?
He took a first place, which was really exciting. The fantasy horses are only judged in the color competition. He actually took champion of the color class, which was so exciting. The judge loved him. She was very excited about him. And then he went on to the callback table for all the champion and reserves of the day. He was up against all these beautiful artist resins and custom models. And so she chose him as the overall reserve champion, which was insane. It was so worth finishing at the last minute. And because he doesn't actually get to compete in the best customs contest, it was like very validating to have him do well in his own little contest. And because he was completely resculpted and unrecognizable as a Breyer model, he actually competed in the artist resin division, which makes this even more special. When I completed this model, I felt the biggest sense of relief. All the struggle, all the uncertainty was worth it. I've never doubted my abilities as much as I had with this project. I think it's important to recognize that and let ourselves have the space to experiment and try. It's okay to scrap things and start again. It's okay to be unsure on how to approach a certain challenge or problem. As long as you don't give up and believe in yourself and your ability, you'll learn for the next project, and each one thereafter will be bigger and greater than before. I hope this journey inspires you to put your own spin on things, to imagine new worlds and pull inspiration from all the things that you hold near and dear to your heart. I hope you can look at Earth and the nature around us and see the beauty that you can infuse within your artwork. There's no such thing as an original idea, so don't seek for originality, seek for authenticity. When you stay true to this and yourself, the outcome will always be more poignant. These projects carry with me through long bouts of time that make them deeply personal in the end. I look at this horse and I see the birth of a new era. I see myself flourishing with beauty and unwavering confidence. Through all the hard times that led me here, this horse is the pivotal point of mental strength, artistic ability, and an exciting future. I have new confidence in building things out of clay and scaling up, and I cannot wait to see what is next. So thank you to Kai, thank you to you for watching this video, and I say thanks to all those hard times and what they taught me.